The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street as Agent Reynolds sat patiently in his sedan, 3 blocks away from the old warehouse. A veteran CIA operative with 15 years of field experience, he had learned that patience was often the most valuable skill in his line of work. He adjusted his position slightly, his back stiff from sitting in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. The car's air conditioning struggled against the summer heat, and tiny beads of sweat formed along his hairline despite the cool air. Reynolds checked his watch again. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., still 2 hours away. Intelligence suggested that a group of international arms dealers would be finalizing a major deal that could potentially put dangerous weapons in the hands of known terrorist cells. This operation had been in the works for months, with Reynolds carefully building his cover and gaining the trust of key informants. One wrong move now could unravel everything. He reached for his thermos of lukewarm coffee and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the warehouse entrance visible in his rearview mirror. The street was mostly deserted at this hour, with only occasional cars passing by. Reynolds had chosen this spot carefully, close enough to maintain surveillance but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. His phone buzzed softly. A text from his handler, status update. Reynolds typed a quick reply, all quiet. No movement yet. Continuing surveillance. He set the phone down and adjusted his binoculars, scanning the perimeter of the warehouse again. Nothing seemed out of place. The rusty chain-link fence, the weathered loading dock, the broken security camera that hadn't worked in years. Everything looked exactly as it had during his previous reconnaissance visits. In the distance, Reynolds noticed a flash of red and blue lights. Police activity wasn't uncommon in this part of town, but it always added an element of unpredictability to operations. He made a mental note but didn't think much of it. Local police weren't briefed on CIA operations, especially ones as sensitive as this. Compartmentalization was standard procedure. Reynolds reached into the glove compartment for his notebook, jotting down the time and a brief observation about a delivery truck that had just turned onto the street. It was probably nothing, but in his line of work, details mattered. Sometimes the smallest observations could become crucial pieces of intelligence later. As he wrote, the flash of lights grew closer. Reynolds glanced up, immediately noticing 2 police cruisers turning onto his street. His pulse quickened slightly, but he remained outwardly calm. There was no reason for them to pay any attention to him, just another guy sitting in his car on a public street. The cruisers slowed as they approached his position. Reynolds kept his expression neutral, avoiding eye contact but not in a way that would seem suspicious. To his surprise, both cruisers pulled up behind his sedan, lights now flashing directly at him. Interesting timing, Reynolds muttered to himself, carefully closing his notebook and sliding it under the seat. He quickly assessed his options. Any sudden movements could escalate the situation. Running would blow his cover completely and jeopardize the operation. The best approach was to play it cool and hope this was just a routine check. The police radio crackled loudly enough for Reynolds to hear through his partially open window. He watched in his side mirror as 2 officers emerged from the first cruiser. Both had their hands resting near their holsters, not a good sign. Reynolds took a deep breath and lowered his window completely as the officers approached, one on each side of his vehicle. The taller officer, a man with a weathered face and gray temples, leaned down slightly. "Afternoon, sir. Mind telling us what you're doing sitting here for the past few hours?" Reynolds offered a friendly smile. "Just waiting for a friend, officer. We're supposed to meet up to look at a motorcycle he's selling. I got here early." The second officer, younger with skeptical eyes, shined a flashlight into the back seat of Reynolds's car, despite the daylight making it unnecessary. "You've been here for quite some time. We got a call from a concerned resident about a suspicious vehicle." Reynolds maintained his calm demeanor. "I'm sorry if I worried anyone. My friend said he might be running late, so I've just been killing time. Is there a problem with me waiting here?" The first officer's expression remained stern. "Can I see some identification, please?" "Of course," Reynolds replied, moving his hand slowly toward his pocket. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now." The younger officer tensed visibly. "Move slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Reynolds nodded, deliberately telegraphing his movements as he reached for his wallet. This was getting complicated. His CIA credentials were hidden in a secret compartment in his shoe, standard procedure for undercover operations. The ID in his wallet matched his cover identity, with no connection to any government agency. As he handed his license to the officer, Reynolds noticed a third police car arriving at the scene. This was escalating quickly and not in a good way. The timing couldn't have been worse with the arms deal just hours away. "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir," the older officer instructed after examining his license. Reynolds complied without argument, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. "Is there something wrong, officer? We've had reports of drug activity in this area. Your behavior matches our profile for surveillance or lookout patterns." The officer's hand remained close to his weapon. "Do you consent to a search of your vehicle?" Reynolds felt a twist in his stomach. His car contained nothing illegal, but there were several pieces of surveillance equipment cleverly hidden in modified compartments. While they weren't immediately visible, a thorough search would certainly uncover them. "I don't consent to a search," Reynolds stated calmly. "I haven't done anything wrong, and I'd like to know why I'm being detained." The atmosphere changed instantly. The younger officer moved closer, his stance more aggressive. "Sir, are you refusing to cooperate with police?" Reynolds maintained his composure. "Not at all, officer. I'm simply exercising my rights. I've identified myself and explained why I'm here. If you're not placing me under arrest, I should be free to go." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather across the street. A few people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Reynolds kept his face turned away from the cameras as much as possible without seeming evasive to the officers. "Place your hands on the hood of the car," the older officer instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reynolds complied, placing his palms flat on the warm metal of his sedan. The younger officer began a pat-down, checking his pockets and feeling along his legs. Reynolds knew the moment was approaching when he would need to reveal his true identity, but he had to be careful. Blowing his cover on a public street with civilians recording would compromise not just this operation, but potentially others as well. "Officer," Reynolds said quietly, "I think we need to talk privately. There's something you should know." The older officer frowned. "Anything you need to say, you can say right here." Reynolds shook his head slightly. "I'm afraid that's not possible. What I need to tell you is a matter of national security." Both officers exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. The younger one snorted dismissively. "Sure it is. We hear that kind of thing all the time." "I understand your skepticism," Reynolds replied evenly, "but I suggest you call this number and verify code phrase Autumn Sentinel." He recited a phone number slowly and clearly. The older officer narrowed his eyes. "You expecting us to just make a random call because you say so?" "It will take less than 2 minutes of your time," Reynolds insisted. "And it will clear up the situation immediately." A third officer had joined them now, a woman with lieutenant bars on her uniform. After a brief consultation with the other officers, she approached Reynolds. "Sir, we're going to secure you in the back of the patrol car while we sort this out." Her tone was professional but firm. Reynolds nodded, understanding that pushing back now would only make things worse. As the officers guided him toward the cruiser, he noticed several more people filming with their phones. This was turning into exactly the kind of scene he had been trained to avoid. The back seat of the police cruiser was uncomfortable, the plastic seat hard and shaped in a way that made it impossible to find a comfortable position. Reynolds watched through the window as the lieutenant stepped away from the group and made a call. Her expression changed from skepticism to surprise within moments of the conversation beginning. Reynolds allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The verification process was working. Now came the tricky part, figuring out how to extract himself from this situation without compromising the operation that was still scheduled to go down in less than 2 hours. Through the cruiser's window, he could see the lieutenant's animated conversation. She glanced over at him several times, her expression increasingly concerned. After hanging up, she immediately approached the other officers, speaking urgently and gesturing toward Reynolds. The crowd across the street had grown larger. Reynolds kept his head down, mind racing through contingency plans. Years of training had prepared him for unexpected complications, but this particular scenario, being detained by local police just hours before a major operation, was going to require some creative problem-solving. The cruiser door suddenly opened, and the lieutenant leaned in. Her entire demeanor had changed. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Somewhere private," Reynolds nodded. "Yes, we do. And we don't have much time." Little did anyone present realize that this unexpected confrontation was about to lead to one of the most unusual joint operations in recent history, with implications that would reach far beyond this quiet street on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. The lieutenant led Reynolds to a small conference room inside the police station. The walls were a faded beige color, decorated with framed certificates and departmental awards. A large coffee stain marked the center of the wooden table where they now sat facing each other. The room smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner. "So," the lieutenant said, folding her hands on the table, "you want to explain exactly what's going on here?" Her name tag read Lieutenant Chen, and her expression was a careful mix of curiosity and caution. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. "First, I need to know this room is secure. No recording devices, no one listening in." Lieutenant Chen raised an eyebrow but nodded. "This is our interview room. It's clean." She reached over and unplugged the single camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "Better?" "Thank you," Reynolds said, his voice low and measured. "As your superiors have now confirmed, I'm with the CIA. I've been working undercover for the past 7 months to infiltrate an international arms dealing network." Leti Chen's expression remained neutral, but her eyes widened slightly. "And you were sitting on Porter Street because—" "In approximately—" Reynolds checked his watch and frowned. 90 minutes now, a major exchange is scheduled to take place at the warehouse 3 blocks from where your officers detained me. Weapons that could arm a small militia are changing hands tonight." The lieutenant sat back in her chair, processing this information. "Why weren't we informed?" "This is happening in our jurisdiction." Reynolds offered a tight smile. "Compartmentalization. Standard procedure for operations of this sensitivity. Too many people knowing creates too many opportunities for leaks." Lieutenant Chen's jaw tightened visibly. "And now?" "Now we have a problem," Reynolds admitted. "My cover may be compromised. Those civilians were filming when your officers detained me. If any of that footage makes it online and the wrong people see it," the lieutenant rubbed her forehead. "So the operation is blown?" "Not necessarily," Reynolds said, surprising himself with the idea forming in his mind. "But we need to adapt quickly." The door opened and a stocky man with salt and pepper hair stepped in. His suit looked expensive but rumpled as if he'd been wearing it for days. "Agent Reynolds," he said with a nod. "I'm Agent Dawson, FBI liaison. Your handler called us in." Reynolds stood and shook the man's hand. The FBI involvement wasn't ideal, but at this point, interagency cooperation was their best option. "The Bureau has been tracking these weapons separately," Dawson explained, taking a seat at the table. "We've got interest in the buyers. Sounds like you've been focused on the suppliers." Lieutenant Chen looked between the 2 federal agents. "So now this is what, a 3-agency operation?" Reynolds nodded slowly. "It appears so, and we have just over an hour to put together a new plan." Dawson pulled out his phone and brought up a satellite image of the warehouse. "Our intelligence suggests at least 6 heavily armed individuals will be present for the exchange. 4 sellers, 2 buyers. "My information says 8, Reynolds countered. 4 sellers, but 4 buyers. The extra 2 are representatives sent to verify the merchandise." Lieutenant Chen stood up and walked to a whiteboard mounted on the wall. She uncapped a marker and started drawing a rough layout of the warehouse and surrounding streets. "Local knowledge time, gentlemen. That warehouse has 3 exits, not 2. There's a tunnel system that was used during Prohibition era that connects to a building half a block east." Both federal agents turned to her with newfound interest. "The property records don't show that," Dawson said, checking his phone again. "They wouldn't," Lieutenant Chen replied. "It's not in any official records. We only know because we busted a drug operation using the same route last year." Reynolds felt a spark of hope. This local knowledge could be the key to salvaging the operation. "Lieutenant, how quickly can you assemble a tactical team?" "Depends on what you're asking for," she said cautiously. "I need officers who can be trusted to follow unusual orders and keep quiet about what they see," Reynolds explained. "And we need them geared up and ready within 30 minutes. Torn Chen considered this for a moment. "I can get you 6 of my best. But I want to be crystal clear. This is still my jurisdiction. Whatever plan we make, my officers' safety comes first." "Understood," Reynolds agreed. "And to be equally clear, national security is my priority. The weapons these people are selling have already been linked to 3 terrorist attacks in Europe." Dawson cleared his throat. "And the Bureau's interest is in following the money trail back to the source. We need at least one of the buyers alive and talking." The tension in the room was palpable. as the three leaders recognized their potentially competing priorities. But Reynolds saw something else too, an opportunity for a unique collaboration that might actually work better than his original plan. "Here's what I propose," he said, standing to join Lieutenant Chen at the whiteboard. "A three-pronged approach that satisfies all our objectives." For the next 20 minutes, they hammered out a plan, arguing over details and compromising where necessary. Reynolds was impressed by Lieutenant Chen's tactical thinking, and even Dawson contributed valuable insights about the financial aspects of the operation. As they finalized the details, Lieutenant Chen left to brief her tactical team. Dawson stepped out to coordinate with his FBI colleagues who were en route. Reynolds took a moment alone in the conference room, reflecting on how completely his day had changed in just a few hours. His phone buzzed, a message from his handler. "Status update?" Reynolds typed back, "Operation parameters changed. Working with local PD and FBI now. We'll update after." The response came quickly. "What?"
"Stand down immediately."
Reynolds frowned at the phone. Standing down wasn't an option. The weapons would change hands, disappear into the black market, and eventually be used to kill innocent people. He couldn't let that happen, not when they had a viable plan to stop it. He put the phone away without responding. He'd deal with the bureaucratic fallout later. The door opened and Lieutenant Chen returned with a tall, broad-shouldered officer. "This is Sergeant Taylor, head of our tactical unit," she introduced. "He has some concerns about the timing." Sergeant Taylor nodded respectfully to Reynolds before spreading out a more detailed blueprint of the warehouse on the table. "The problem is the approach. There's about 50 yards of open space around that building. No cover. If they have lookouts, they'll spot us coming from any direction." Reynolds studied the blueprint, noting the sergeant's experience showed in his assessment. "What if you weren't approaching as police?" Both officers looked at him questioningly. "I have gear in my car," Reynolds explained. "Communications equipment, but also some specialized items that might help us get closer without raising alarms." Lieutenant Chen crossed her arms. "What kind of specialized items are we talking about?" "Nothing illegal," Reynolds assured her. "But my agency has access to certain technologies that aren't widely available." After a moment of consideration, Lieutenant Chen nodded to an officer waiting by the door. "Get Agent Reynolds' personal effects from lockup and bring his car around to the back entrance." As they waited, Dawson returned with news. "We've got 4 FBI agents 10 minutes out. They're bringing additional surveillance equipment." The pieces were falling into place. Reynolds felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before an operation, but this time mixed with something unfamiliar, a sense of improvisation that went against his years of careful planning and preparation. When his equipment arrived, Reynolds quickly sorted through it, pulling out small devices that looked like ordinary cell phones but were actually advanced communication tools with encrypted channels. "These will allow us all to stay in contact without risk of interception," he explained, handing them out to Lieutenant Chen and Sergeant Taylor. "They also have thermal imaging capabilities that work through most standard building materials." Sergeant Taylor whistled low. "The department's been trying to get budget approval for something like this for years." Reynolds continued unpacking, revealing what looked like ordinary work vests, but were actually lightweight body armor. "These won't stop a rifle round, but they'll handle most handguns. And they don't look like tactical gear from a distance." Lieutenant Chen's tactical team entered, 6 officers in plain clothes rather than uniforms. They eyed the federal agent with a mixture of curiosity and professional assessment. "All right, people, gather round," Lieutenant Chen called. "We've got a unique operation tonight. Agent Reynolds here is CIA, running an undercover operation that we're now assisting with. Agent Dawson represents the FBI's interests. This is an unusual situation for everyone, but we're all on the same side." Reynolds watched as the officers absorbed this information, looking for any signs of resistance or resentment. Instead, he saw professionals ready to adapt to changing circumstances, exactly what they needed. "The targets are arms dealers," Lieutenant Chen continued. "Dangerous, well-armed, and likely to shoot rather than surrender. Our job is containment and arrest. Agent Reynolds will walk you through the specifics." Reynolds stepped forward, feeling the weight of these officers' lives now partially in his hands. He'd never planned to lead a joint task force, but here he was. "Thank you all for your flexibility. Here's what we know about the players and the plan." As he briefed the team, Reynolds noticed how quickly they grasped the complexities of the operation. These weren't just local cops dealing with street crime. They were skilled tactical operators who understood the high stakes. By the time FBI agents arrived with their additional equipment, a remarkable transformation had taken place. What had begun as a disastrous compromise of his cover had evolved into potentially the most comprehensive operation Reynolds had ever been part of. They moved to the station's garage where officers were changing into their tactical gear, modified with Reynolds' specialized equipment. The energy in the room was focused, each person checking weapons and communication devices with practiced efficiency. Kyo. Chen approached Reynolds as he was securing his own vest. "You know," she said quietly, "when this is all over, we should talk about improving interagency communication. This whole situation could have been avoided." Reynolds nodded. "You're right. And I suspect my superiors will be having similar conversations after tonight. Assuming we all make it through," she added with grim humor. "We will," Reynolds said with more confidence than he felt. "This plan is actually better than my original one. More resources, better local knowledge, and the element of surprise is still partially intact." Lieutenant Chen checked her watch. T-minus 30 minutes. "Ready to move out?" Reynolds took a deep breath and gave a firm nod. "Let's do this." As they headed toward their vehicles, Reynolds couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. What had started as one of the worst days of his career might end up being one of his most successful operations. If everything went according to their hastily assembled plan. What none of them realized was that the arms dealers had made some last-minute changes of their own. Changes that would test this unlikely alliance to its limits. The convoy moved silently through the back streets, headlights off, guided only by the ambient city glow. 3 unmarked vans and Reynolds' sedan formed a loose procession, maintaining distance from each other to avoid drawing attention. In the lead vehicle, Reynolds sat beside Lieutenant Chen, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee, the only outward sign of his tension. "Stop that," Lieutenant Chen said without looking at him. "You're making me nervous." Reynolds stilled his hand. "Sorry, old habit. Undercover for 7 months," she said, keeping her eyes on the road. "That's a long time to play someone else." "You get used to it," Reynolds replied. "After a while, the cover starts to feel as real as your actual life. Sometimes more real." The lieutenant glanced at him briefly. "Sounds lonely." Reynolds hadn't expected that observation, especially not from a tough police lieutenant he'd met just hours ago. What surprised him more was that she was right. "It's part of the job," he said simply. The radio crackled. "Team 2 in position at the east entrance," came Sergeant Taylor's voice. "Team 3 covering the tunnel exit," added Agent Dawson from the 3rd vehicle. Chen picked up her radio. "Team 1 approaching north side now. 5 minutes to position." Reynolds checked his watch. The exchange was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. If their intelligence was correct, the sellers should already be inside, preparing the merchandise for inspection. The buyers would arrive soon, probably in multiple vehicles, staggered to avoid attracting attention. The van slowed as they approached the industrial area surrounding the warehouse. Lieutenant Chen killed the engine 2 blocks away, letting momentum carry them to a stop in the shadow of an abandoned factory. "This is as close as we drive," she said, turning to the 4 officers in the back of the van. "Comms check." Each officer tested their communication device, the specialized equipment Reynolds had provided working flawlessly. Unlike standard police radios, these devices transmitted using encrypted signals that bounced between multiple frequencies, making them virtually impossible to detect or intercept. "Remember," Reynolds said as they prepared to exit the vehicle, "these people are professionals. They'll have counter-surveillance measures in place. Move like you belong here and stay in character until the signal." The officers nodded, their expressions serious. They were dressed as utility workers, wearing vests with a fake company logo Reynolds had quickly designed at the station. Each carried concealed weapons and body armor beneath their workman's clothes. Chen gave final instructions. "Officer Park, you and Officer Winters take the northwest approach. Reynolds and I will come from the northeast. Officer Vasquez, you're our eyes up high. Get to that water tower and maintain visual contact." "Officer Vasquez." A compact woman with steady hands nodded and immediately separated from the group. moving toward the rusted water tower that overlooked the entire area. As they split into their assigned pairs, Reynolds felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the familiar sensation of heightened awareness that had saved his life more than once. Something felt off, but he couldn't identify what. The night was quiet, maybe too quiet for this part of the industrial district. "I don't like this," he murmured to Lieutenant Chen as they walked casually toward the warehouse, carrying toolboxes like workers on a late-night repair job. "What's wrong?" she asked, maintaining her relaxed posture while her eyes scanned their surroundings. "Not sure yet," Reynolds admitted. "Just a feeling." They continued their approach, passing under a streetlight with broken bulbs. As they neared the warehouse, Reynolds spotted the first anomaly, a black SUV parked where there shouldn't be one, half hidden behind a dumpster. "That vehicle wasn't in our briefing," he whispered, not breaking stride. Chen nodded almost imperceptibly. "Plates are covered." Reynolds touched his earpiece. "All teams be advised. Unknown vehicle at the north perimeter. Possible additional players on the board." "Copy that," came Sergeant Taylor's response. "We're seeing movement at the east entrance, too." "More than expected." Agent Dawson's voice crackled through next. "Thermal imaging shows at least 12 bodies inside, not 8. Something's changed." Reynolds and Lieutenant Chen exchanged glances. Their carefully constructed plan was already facing complications. They had prepared for 8 targets, 4 sellers and 4 buyers. 12 meant either additional security or another party involved in the transaction. "Hold positions," Reynolds instructed. "Let's see who these extra players are before we adjust." They found cover behind a stack of rusted metal containers, about 50 yards from the warehouse's main entrance. Lieutenant Chen pulled out specialized binoculars from her toolkit and focused on the building. 2 guards at the front door, she reported, armed, trying not to look obvious about it. Another on the roof, northwest corner. Reynolds took the binoculars and scanned the area himself. The rooftop guard was a new addition, not part of the original security arrangement he'd been briefed on. "They've increased security. They're nervous about something." "About you, maybe?" Lieutenant Chen suggested. "If your cover was blown..." "No," Reynolds said with certainty. "If they knew about me, they'd have canceled the meet entirely. This is something else." He zoomed in on the warehouse windows, most of which were covered with grime or boarded over. Through one partially clear pane, he caught glimpses of movement inside. People arranging crates on tables, preparing for inspection. "Officer Vasquez," he called quietly into his comm. "What's your visual from up there?" "I count 3 vehicles on the far side of the warehouse," came the response. 2 SUVs and what looks like an armored transport van. "Heavy security presence," Reynolds frowned. An armored transport wasn't part of the expected equipment. These weapons were supposed to be demonstration models, with the actual shipment to follow after payment was verified. An armored transport suggested the full shipment was already here. "They've changed the terms of the deal," he realized aloud. "This isn't just a verification meeting anymore. They're doing the full exchange tonight." Lieutenant Chen's expression hardened. "That changes things. We don't have enough personnel to contain a situation this size." Reynolds thought quickly, weighing their options. Calling for backup would take time they didn't have. Aborting the operation meant losing track of weapons that could kill hundreds of people. Proceeding with their original plan against superior numbers was dangerously risky. "Agent Dawson," he called into his comm. "Are your FBI backup teams nearby?" 20 minutes out," Dawson replied, frustration evident in his voice. "Traffic accident on the bridge slowed them down." 20 minutes was too long. Reynolds made a decision. "New plan. We observe only until FBI backup arrives. No engagement unless absolutely necessary." As if the universe had heard his caution and decided to test it, the warehouse door swung open at that moment. 2 men stepped out, scanning the area with professional vigilance. Behind them came a third figure, a tall, thin man in an expensive suit that Reynolds recognized immediately. "That's Crane," he whispered, a chill running through him. "Anton Crane." Lieutenant Chen glanced at him. "You know him?" "He's not supposed to be here," Reynolds said, his mind racing. "Crane never shows up for exchanges personally. He's too high up the chain." Crane was the organization's money man, the financial genius who laundered their profits through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. His presence at a weapons exchange was unprecedented and deeply troubling. More figures emerged from the warehouse, armed guards flanking a shorter man with a distinctive limp. Even from this distance, Reynolds could see the man was nervous, his movements jerky and uncertain as he spoke with Crane. "Something's wrong," Reynolds muttered. "This isn't a normal exchange. It looks more like—" Before he could finish his thought, the scene before them changed dramatically. Crane made a sharp gesture, and two guards grabbed the limping man by the arms. Even from 50 yards away, they could see the man's expression of shock and fear. "They're executing him," Lithri Chen breathed, reaching instinctively for her weapon. Reynolds placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Wait, we don't know what's happening yet." Through the binoculars, he watched as Crane leaned in close to the captured man, speaking intently. The man shook his head vigorously, clearly denying whatever accusation Crane was making. "All teams, stand by," Reynolds instructed into his comm. "Possible hostile situation developing between the sellers. Do not engage unless civilian lives are at risk." Just then, a new set of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching the warehouse from the south entrance, the buyers arriving for the exchange, unaware of the drama unfolding. "This is about to get complicated," Lieutenant Chen murmured. Reynolds nodded grimly. "If the buyers walk into an internal conflict, this could turn into a bloodbath." The approaching vehicles, two black sedans with diplomatic plates, slowed as they neared the warehouse. Reynolds recognized the plates with a jolt of surprise. "Those are diplomatic vehicles," he said. "Eastern European, possibly Balkan." Lieutenant Chen stiffened beside him. "Government buyers?" "Or someone using government cover," Reynolds replied. Either way, this just became an international incident waiting to happen. As the sedans parked, Crane and his men quickly shifted their attention, releasing the limping man who scurried back inside the warehouse. Whatever internal dispute had been occurring was temporarily set aside as business took precedence. Reynolds watched as men in suits emerged from the diplomatic vehicles. Unlike the sellers, they made no attempt to conceal their security detail. 4 heavily armed men who took positions around the cars, openly displaying automatic weapons. FBI team reports they've cut their ETA to 12 minutes. Agent Dawson's voice came through the comm. "That might be too late," Reynolds responded, watching the buyers and sellers exchange formal greetings. "They're starting the transaction now." Li Chen turned to him. "What's our play here?" "We're outgunned and outnumbered." Reynolds considered their options. Direct confrontation would lead to casualties on all sides. Waiting might mean losing the weapons and the buyers. They needed a third option. "Officer Vasquez," he called quietly. "From your position, can you see inside the warehouse through any of the skylights?" "Affirmative," came the response. "I can see most of the main floor. They've got crates open displaying merchandise. Looks like automatic rifles, maybe 40 or 50 of them. Some larger crates remain closed." Reynolds made his decision. "New plan. We let the inspection proceed. Once they've verified the weapons and before money changes hands, we create a diversion at the east entrance. Sergeant Taylor's team will draw their security that way. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Chen and I will approach from the north, targeting Crane specifically." "And the diplomatic personnel?" Furrion asked. "Agent Dawson's team will handle containing them," Reynolds replied. "The diplomatic angle complicates things, but these people are buying illegal weapons. Their immunity doesn't extend to that." As they finalized the new plan, communicating positions and timing to all teams, Reynolds kept his binoculars trained on the warehouse entrance. The buyers and sellers had moved inside, but guards remained positioned at all entrances, alert and watchful. 5 minutes, Reynolds instructed. "All teams prepare to execute on my mark." Li Chen checked her weapon one final time, then looked at Reynolds. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm glad my officers stopped you today. Seems like you could use the backup." Reynolds smiled despite the tension. "For what it's worth, I'm beginning to agree with you." Little did either of them know that inside the warehouse, an entirely unexpected development was about to change everything once again. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense as Crane led the diplomatic delegation toward the displayed merchandise. Metal tables lined the center of the space, each bearing neatly arranged weapons. Automatic rifles, compact submachine guns, and several disassembled sniper rifles. The larger crates remained closed at the far end of the room, their contents a mystery that had Reynolds deeply concerned. 2 minutes to position, Reynolds whispered into his comm as he and Lieutenant Chen crept closer to the north entrance. The night had grown darker, clouds obscuring the moon and providing additional cover for their approach. "Copy that," came Sergeant Taylor's response from the east side. Ready on your mark. Lieutenant Chen touched Reynolds' arm, pointing to a figure moving along the warehouse roof, a guard making his rounds, assault rifle slung across his chest. They froze, pressing themselves against the cold metal of a shipping container until the guard passed. Almost missed him, Reynolds murmured, nodding his thanks for the warning. That's why you need local backup, Lieutenant Chen replied with the ghost of a smile. Through his earpiece, Reynolds could hear Officer Vasquez providing updates from her elevated position. Main floor has 14 individuals now. Arms are being inspected. One of the diplomatic types is field stripping a rifle, checking the mechanism. They know their weapons, Reynolds noted. Not just bureaucrats. Military background, maybe, Lieutenant Chen suggested. Or intelligence service, Reynolds countered. Makes this even more interesting. As they reached their final position near the north entrance, Reynolds could see through a small, grimy window. Inside, Crane was gesturing toward the larger crates while speaking to a well-dressed man who appeared to be the leader of the diplomatic delegation. The man nodded approvingly, then motioned to one of his security personnel who approached with a metal briefcase. They're moving to payment, Reynolds said urgently. All teams prepare to execute. But before he could give the signal, something unexpected happened. The limping man from earlier, the one Crane had nearly executed, suddenly emerged from a side room, followed by two new figures Reynolds didn't recognize. The newcomers wore expensive suits similar to the diplomatic delegation, but carried themselves differently, with a confidence that spoke of authority rather than muscle. Hold position, Reynolds instructed quickly. We have new players on the scene. Through the window, they watched as these new arrivals caused an immediate reaction. Crane's face showed genuine surprise, perhaps the first authentic emotion Reynolds had seen from the man. The diplomatic leader looked equally startled, then quickly composed himself. Officer Vasquez, do you have visual on these new individuals? Reynolds asked. Affirmative, came the response. Two men in suits, no visible weapons. One is showing some kind of identification to both parties. Everyone's looking very uncomfortable suddenly. Reynolds strained to see more clearly through the dirty glass. The lead newcomer was indeed displaying credentials of some kind, moving with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. But that made no sense. There was no planned law enforcement operation here besides their own. They're not ours, Lieutenant Chen whispered, clearly thinking the same thing. Interpol, maybe? Reynolds suggested. Or undercover from another agency? Before they could speculate further, the situation inside deteriorated rapidly. One of Crane's guards reached for his weapon, and the diplomatic security team immediately raised theirs in response. The newcomers stepped back, hands raised in a calming gesture that had no effect on the escalating tension. This is about to get ugly, Reynolds said. New plan. We move now. Identify ourselves as law enforcement. Sergeant Taylor, prepare for flashbang deployment on my mark. Ready, came the sergeant's tense reply. Agent Dawson, move your team to secure the south exit. Don't let anyone escape that way. Moving now, Dawson confirmed. Reynolds turned to Lieutenant Chen. We'll take the north entrance together. Ready? She nodded, her expression focused and determined. Ready. All teams execute in 3, 2, 1. The next moments unfolded in controlled chaos. Sergeant Taylor's team deployed flashbang grenades through the east windows, the devices exploding in blinding light and disorienting sound. Simultaneously, Reynolds and Lieutenant Chen breached the north entrance, weapons drawn. Federal agents. Police, everyone down on the ground now, Reynolds shouted, his voice carrying over the ringing aftermath of the flashbangs. The reaction inside was immediate but varied. Some of Crane's men dropped to the floor as instructed, while others scrambled for cover, weapons half raised but hesitant to fire. The diplomatic security team moved to protect their principals, forming a human shield around them. And the mysterious newcomers? They displayed the calm professionalism of experienced law enforcement, hands raised to show they weren't threats, but making no move to lie on the ground either. As officers flooded in from multiple entrances, securing the perimeter and moving to detain the arms dealers, Reynolds kept his weapon trained on Crane, who stood surprisingly still, a calculating look on his face. Anton Crane, Reynolds called out. You're under arrest for illegal weapons trafficking and conspiracy to provide material support to terrorist organizations. A flicker of recognition passed across Crane's face as he studied Reynolds. Ah, he said softly. The businessman from Toronto. I thought you seemed too interested in our operation. Despite the chaos around him, he maintained an eerie composure. Chen moved forward with restraints, securing Crane's wrists behind his back while Reynolds kept his weapon ready. Around them, officers were detaining the other suspects, securing weapons and establishing control of the scene. Agent Dawson approached the diplomatic delegation, who were protesting loudly about immunity and international law. "We'll sort out your diplomatic status later," Dawson informed them coolly. "Right now you're being detained at a crime scene involving illegal weapons trafficking." Reynolds finally turned his attention to the mysterious newcomers, who were now showing identification to Sergeant Taylor. As Reynolds approached, the lead man turned toward him. "Agent Reynolds, I presume," the man said, extending his hand. "Agent Blackwood, CIA Special Activities Division. Looks like we need to have a conversation about operational overlap." Reynolds stared in disbelief. "Special activities? I wasn't informed of any parallel operation." Blackwood offered a thin smile. "That was rather the point. We've been tracking Crane for his financial connections to several hostile intelligence services. When we learned about this exchange, we decided to make our move." Lieutenant Chen joined them, having secured Crane to a support pillar under guard. "So we have two separate CIA operations running simultaneously, and neither knew about the other?" Her tone made it clear what she thought about such interagency communication. "The need-to-know principle sometimes has unintended consequences," Blackwood acknowledged. "Though I must say this joint operation with local law enforcement is unusual." Reynolds explained the circumstances that had led to their collaboration, watching as Blackwood's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. "Improvised interagency cooperation," Blackwood mused. "Highly irregular but effective, judging by the results." Around them, the warehouse had transformed from an arms bazaar to a processed crime scene in minutes. Officers were cataloging weapons, securing evidence, and preparing detainees for transport. The larger crates had been opened, revealing shoulder-mounted missile launchers, weapons far more dangerous than they'd initially expected. "Those would have been catastrophic in the wrong hands," Reynolds noted, gesturing toward the missiles. "That's why we were going to intervene," Blackwood explained. "Our intelligence suggested the buyers were acting as proxies for a non-state actor with known terrorist affiliations." Lieutenant Chen crossed her arms. "And you couldn't have shared that information with other agencies because—" Blackwood had the good grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Operational security concerns. We had reason to believe there were leaks in certain departments." "Not in my department," Lieutenant Chen said firmly. "Evidently not," Blackwood conceded. "Your officers performed admirably tonight." As they spoke, Agent Dawson approached with news. "FBI backup has arrived. They're establishing a perimeter and bringing in transport vehicles. We'll need to sort out jurisdiction for the arrests." Blackwood shook his head. "The diplomatic angle complicates things. State Department will need to be involved." "And the weapons?" Lieutenant Chen asked. "Will be secured by ATF," Dawson replied. "They're en route now." Reynolds surveyed the scene, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over him. What had begun as a potential disaster, being detained by local police and having his cover blown, had transformed into something unprecedented. A successful multi-agency operation that had prevented weapons of war from reaching dangerous hands. "Your officers did well," he said to Lieutenant Chen. "This could have gone very differently." She nodded. "So did you, for someone who had his day completely derailed." A commotion near the south entrance drew their attention. Two men in suits were entering, flashing credentials that had the FBI agent stepping aside respectfully. "Now who's joining the party?" Lieutenant Chen murmured. "Department of Homeland Security." Blackwood identified them with a slight frown. "This gets more interesting by the minute." The DHS agents made a beeline for their group, focused particularly on Reynolds and Blackwood. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman with sharp eyes, addressed them directly. "Gentlemen, I understand we have CIA, FBI, and local law enforcement all operating at this scene," she stated. "I'm Deputy Director Clark. My team will be taking over coordination of this operation effective immediately." Reynolds and Blackwood exchanged glances. This level of DHS involvement suggested the case had implications beyond what either of them had realized. "May I ask why Homeland Security is asserting jurisdiction?" Blackwood inquired carefully. Deputy Director Clark's expression remained neutral. The buyers you've detained are connected to an ongoing national security investigation that intersects with domestic terrorism concerns. That puts it squarely in our wheelhouse. Reynolds watched this new development with increasing curiosity. The operation had started as his simple surveillance of arms dealers. Now it involved local police, FBI, multiple CIA divisions, and Homeland Security. Something bigger was clearly at play. "We'll need full briefings from all of you," Clark continued. "Starting with you, Agent Reynolds. I understand this entire operation began because local police detained you during surveillance." Reynolds nodded. "That's correct, though I'd characterize it more as a fortunate miscommunication that led to enhanced operational capabilities." Lieutenant Chen raised an eyebrow at his diplomatic phrasing but nodded in agreement. "My officers were responding to a legitimate call about suspicious activity. We had no way of knowing Agent Reynolds was conducting federal business." Clark's expression softened slightly. "Sometimes the best operations are the ones we don't plan. I'll need statements from everyone involved, but preliminary assessment suggests this will be classified as a successful interdiction." As DHS personnel began organizing the various agency representatives, Reynolds found himself standing beside Lieutenant Chen near the warehouse entrance, watching the controlled chaos of a major multi-agency operation. "Not how you expected your day to end, is it?" she asked. Reynolds shook his head. "Not even close. I was supposed to be home catching up on paperwork by now." "And I was supposed to be finishing shift reports," she replied with a small smile. "Instead, we're in the middle of what might be the most unusual joint operation in recent history." As they stood there, Reynolds realized something significant had happened beyond just stopping dangerous weapons from reaching the wrong hands. Barriers between agencies that typically operated in isolation had been temporarily broken down, creating a synergy that had made them all more effective. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there might be something valuable to learn from how this all played out." Lieutenant Chen nodded. "Like how sometimes the best way to get things done is to ignore the usual bureaucracy and just work together." "Exactly," Reynolds agreed, "though I suspect that lesson might get lost once the official reports are written." A junior officer approached Lieutenant Chen with an update, and as she stepped away to handle it, Reynolds took a moment to observe the scene around him. In the span of a single day, a routine surveillance operation had transformed into something that would likely change protocols across multiple agencies. And it had all started because local police officers had simply been doing their job. 2 weeks later, Reynolds sat in an unfamiliar conference room at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters. The walls were a sterile off-white, decorated only with framed photos of current and former department leadership. He checked his watch. The debriefing was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes, and he was characteristically early. The door opened and Lieutenant Chen walked in, looking slightly out of place in her formal police dress uniform. Her usual confident expression softened briefly upon seeing him. "Agent Reynolds," she greeted him with a nod. "Good to see you again." "Likewise, Lieutenant," he replied, genuinely pleased to see a familiar face. "How are things back at your precinct?" She took a seat beside him at the long table. "Still processing all the paperwork from our little adventure. My officers haven't stopped talking about it. Especially Officer Vasquez. She's thinking about applying to the FBI now." Reynolds smiled. "She'd be a good fit. Her observation skills were impressive." Before they could continue catching up, the door opened again. Agent Dawson entered, followed by Agent Blackwood and Deputy Director Clark. Behind them came several high-ranking officials Reynolds didn't recognize, representatives from various intelligence agencies, judging by their bearing and the respectful way Clark greeted them. "Thank you all for coming," Clark began once everyone was seated. "What we're discussing today remains classified at the highest levels. Nothing leaves this room without my explicit authorization." She activated a wall-mounted screen, displaying photos of the weapons seized during the warehouse operation. "Thanks to your combined efforts 2 weeks ago, we intercepted the largest illegal weapons shipment on American soil in the past decade. The missile systems alone could have caused catastrophic damage in the wrong hands." Photos of Crane and the diplomatic delegation appeared next. Anton Crane remains in custody, cooperating in exchange for considerations at sentencing. His information has already led to 3 additional arrests across Europe. The diplomatic personnel have been declared persona non grata and expelled from the country, though their home government continues to deny official involvement. Reynolds noticed Lieutenant Chen watching the presentation with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief, as if she still couldn't quite believe her department had been involved in something of this magnitude. "But that's not why we're here today," Clark continued, her tone shifting. "We're here to discuss what we can learn from how this operation unfolded." She clicked to a new slide showing a complex organizational chart with arrows connecting various agencies, all converging on the warehouse operation. We had 4 separate agencies: CIA, FBI, local law enforcement, and eventually DHS, all working the same case from different angles, with minimal communication between them. By all standard protocols, this should have been a disaster. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Reynolds caught Lieutenant Chen's eye, sharing a knowing look. They'd both expected this assessment. Instead, Clark continued, surprising them, it was one of the most successful joint operations in recent memory. The question before us today is why, and more importantly, what can we learn from it? The room fell silent as officials exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the typical post-operation assessment that focused on failures and assigned blame. Clark was asking for something different. Reynolds decided to speak up. "Permission to offer an observation, Deputy Director?" Clark nodded. "That's why you're here, Agent Reynolds. You were ground zero for this unusual collaboration." Reynolds gathered his thoughts. "I believe our success stemmed from 3 factors. First, necessity. None of us had time to get bogged down in jurisdictional disputes or bureaucratic approvals. Second, complementary expertise. Each agency brought unique skills to the table that filled gaps the others couldn't. And third, perhaps most importantly, personal relationships formed in the field." Lieutenant Chen straightened in her chair. "I'd like to add something to that, if I may." When Clark nodded, she continued, "My officers responded to a suspicious person call and found Agent Reynolds. By normal protocol, that should have ended his operation then and there. But when the situation changed, everyone involved adapted quickly, putting the mission above territorial concerns. Agent Blackwood, who had been quietly observing, joined in. There's another factor worth considering. The compartmentalization that we rely on for operational security, even within the same agency, created unnecessary risk in this case. My team didn't know about Agent Reynolds' operation, and he didn't know about ours. We could have compromised each other." Deputy Director Clark nodded thoughtfully, "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting. The Director has authorized a pilot program based on the model that emerged from your operation." She clicked to a new slide showing a framework for interagency cooperation. "We're calling it the Joint Rapid Response Initiative. The idea is to create pre-established protocols for immediate cooperation between agencies when situations demand it, bypassing the usual bureaucratic channels while maintaining necessary security measures." Reynolds leaned forward, intrigued. Initiatives like this had been proposed before, but they typically died in committee, victims of territorial thinking and institutional resistance. Each major metropolitan area will have designated liaisons from federal agencies who are pre-cleared to work with local law enforcement when necessary, Clark explained. These liaisons will have the authority to make real-time decisions about information sharing and resource allocation without waiting for approval from Washington. Lieutenant Chen looked skeptical. "And the agencies are actually agreeing to this?" Clark's expression was wry. "Let's just say that when the president personally calls agency directors after learning about missile launchers being sold on American soil, resistance tends to evaporate." A senior CIA official spoke up. "There are legitimate security concerns with this model. How do we ensure sensitive information doesn't leak?" "Fair question," Clark acknowledged. "That's why we're starting with a limited pilot program, focusing on specific types of threats: weapons trafficking, terrorist financing, and critical infrastructure threats. Each liaison will be specially vetted, and information sharing will be specific to active operations, not general intelligence." Reynolds considered the implications. It was a significant departure from the siloed approach that had dominated interagency relations for decades. The potential benefits were enormous, but so were the cultural obstacles to implementation. "And you want us involved in designing this program?" he asked, sensing where this was heading. Clark nodded. "Who better than the people who accidentally created the model? We're forming a task force to establish the protocols, training requirements, and security parameters. I'd like all of you to be part of it. Lieutenant Chen exchanged a look with Reynolds. I'm a precinct lieutenant, not a policy expert. Exactly, Clark replied. We need perspectives from all levels, not just headquarters theorists. Your officers were on the ground making split-second decisions that worked. We need to understand why and how to replicate that success. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed the practical challenges of implementing such a program. Throughout the discussion, Reynolds found himself repeatedly impressed by Lieutenant Chen's practical insights. Her frontline experience brought a reality check to some of the more ambitious proposals from the federal representatives. When the meeting finally adjourned, Reynolds and Lieutenant Chen found themselves walking together toward the building's exit. So, she said casually, a task force member now. Quite a change from undercover work. Reynolds nodded. Not exactly what I expected when I woke up that morning 2 weeks ago. Then again, being detained by local police wasn't in my plans either. She smiled at that. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. They reached the security checkpoint where they would need to go separate ways to retrieve their weapons from storage. I've been meaning to ask, Reynolds said, pausing before they parted. That day when your officers approached my car, what made them so suspicious? I've conducted similar surveillance dozens of times without attracting attention. Lieutenant Chen's expression turned thoughtful. The call came from an elderly resident who lives across from where you were parked. She said you'd been there for hours, just watching. But here's the interesting part. When my officers asked her later, she admitted it wasn't your behavior that concerned her. Then what was it? Reynolds asked. She said, and I quote, he looked too professional to be up to no good. And that worried me more than if he'd looked suspicious. Apparently, her late husband was in military intelligence, and she recognized the signs. Reynolds laughed softly, undone by looking too competent. That's a new one. Sometimes our training works against us, she agreed. We forget that normal people don't sit perfectly still for hours, maintaining optimal sight lines. They reached the point where they needed to separate. Reynolds extended his hand. It's been an honor working with you, Lieutenant. I look forward to continuing on the task force. She shook his hand firmly. Likewise, Agent Reynolds. Though I still think you could use some training on how to look appropriately suspicious. Might help you blend in better next time. As they parted ways, Reynolds reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. From a moment of potential disaster, an undercover CIA agent being detained by local police had emerged not only a successful operation, but potentially a new model for how agencies could work together. 6 months later, the Joint Rapid Response Initiative launched its pilot program in 12 cities across the country. Reynolds, having completed his role on the design task force, returned to field operations with a new assignment, serving as one of the first federal liaisons to local law enforcement under the new initiative. His first posting? The same city where Lieutenant Chen's officers had once detained him as a suspicious person. On his first day, he walked into the precinct, carrying a small box of donuts, a peace offering, and a joke all in one. Lieutenant Chen met him in the lobby, shaking her head at the cliché but accepting the box with a smile. Welcome to the team, Agent Reynolds, she said, leading him toward the briefing room where her officers waited. Try not to look too professional around here. People might get suspicious. As they entered the room, Reynolds noticed a familiar face. Officer Vasquez, now wearing an FBI trainee badge on a visitor lanyard. She was speaking with Sergeant Taylor, apparently there for a cross-training day under the new initiative. The room quieted as Lieutenant Chen called for attention. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Agent Reynolds, our new federal liaison under the Joint Rapid Response Initiative. Some of you might remember him from the warehouse operation last year. Several officers nodded in recognition. One called out, "Is he still driving that obvious surveillance vehicle?" Laughter rippled through the room, breaking the ice immediately. Reynolds smiled, feeling unexpectedly at home among these loca.